Las Tidfoners York. The fall from Manhattan rain poured over the glowing skyscrapers of New York City, turning the lights of Manhattan into a blurred sea of gold and red. On the 70th floor of the prestigious Rothschild Tower, Xavier Rothchild stood near a floor-to-ceiling glass wall, swirling a glass of aged scotch. At 32, Xavier was the undisputed king of Wall Street, ruthless, brilliant, and untouchable. He had built Rothchild Global into a $100 billion empire through pure instinct and an iron fist. He heard the heavy wooden doors of his penthouse office open, followed by footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Without turning around, Xavier spoke in a calm, authoritative voice, noting that the board had already approved the merger an hour ago. But the voice that answered was cold and mocking. It was Daniel, his stepbrother. Daniel declared that the board hadn't approved a merger. They had approved his total takeover. Xavier turned around slowly, a subtle smirk playing on his lips, assuming it was a desperate joke. But his smile vanished when Daniel pulled a heavy silencer from his jacket and screwed it onto the barrel of a black handgun. Xavier reached toward his mahogany desk to hit the security intercom, but Daniel casually remarked that security now belonged to him. At that moment, two heavy, set bodyguards stepped into the room, blocking the exit. Then out from the shadows stepped Eva, Xavier's stunning fiancée, dressed in an elegant red silk gown. Shock finally cracked Xavier's composure. When he asked her what was happening, Eva looked at him with emotionless eyes, and whispered that he was simply too hard to control. Before Xavier could react, Daniel fired. A muffled gun blast tore through the quiet room, striking Xavier in the shoulder. The force knocked him backward through the glass doors leading out to the rain-drenched balcony. Stumbling against the slick tile, clutching his bleeding chest, Xavier backed up against the low glass railing. Daniel stepped outside, raising the gun once more, coldly explaining that tomorrow's headlines would announce the tragic mental breakdown and suicide of billionaire Xavier Rothchild. With a brutal kick to Xavier's chest, Daniel launched him over the edge. Xavier's desperate screams dissolved into the roaring storm as he plunged into the pitch-black abyss of Manhattan. Miles away, in a trash-strewn, dark alleyway in Brooklyn, 20-year-old Ariyan lay unconscious on the wet asphalt. He was a broke, forgotten kid, beaten half to death by local gang thugs over unpaid debts. As the thug kicked Ariyan one last time and walked away into the dark, Ariyan's heart gave its final, weak beat. Then, a sudden bolt of lightning ripped across the sky. In a blinding flash of cosmic collision, Xavier's dying consciousness collided with Ariyan's lifeless body. High-stakes boardrooms, betrayal, and gunshots fused violently with memories of starvation, cold nights, and eviction notices. Ariyan's eyes snapped open. He gasped violently for air. Sitting upright like a corpse rising from the grave, he clutched his chest, breathing heavily, staring at his rough, scarred hands in utter disbelief. His voice was raspy as he muttered in confusion, asking where the penthouse was. Stumbling to his feet, he looked down into a dirty water puddle on the alley floor. Reflected in the rain was not the refined, sharp face of 32-year-old billionaire Xavier Rothchild, but the bruised, young face of a 20-year-old street kid. Panicked, Ariyan stumbled out of the alley and burst into a nearby neon-lit bodega. Above the counter, a small television flashed an urgent breaking news banner. Billionaire CEO Xavier Rothchild dead after tragic fall. On the screen, Daniel was holding a press conference, wiping away fake tears alongside Eva, as he announced he would carry on his brother's legacy. Ariyan stared at the screen, his hands clenching into tight, trembling fists. The confusion in his eyes slowly hardened into a cold, lethal glare. Looking at his reflection in the bodega mirror, a dark smirk crossed his new face. He knew Daniel thought he had buried him, but the dead don't stay buried in New York. The Brooklyn hustle, the damp smell of mold and cheap takeout filled the cramped, single-room apartment in Brooklyn. Xavier, now trapped inside the young, battered body of Ariyan, sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, staring at his rough hands. He had spent the entire night processing the memories of the boy whose life he now inhabited. Ariyan was an orphan, drowning in debt to a ruthless local gang known as the Kings, with less than $80 left in his crumpled wallet. To the rest of the world, Xavier Rothchild was dead. But in this rotting room, the mind of Manhattan's greatest financial prodigy was alive, sharp, and hungry for blood. Ariyan stood up, washed the grime off his face with cold sink water, and stepped out into the chaotic streets of Brooklyn. He walked straight into a dingy, smoke-filled underground gambling den run by a local loan shark named Victor. The room buzzed with illegal sports betting and high-stakes poker. With only $50 in his pocket, Ariyan sat down at a digital trading terminal hidden in the back room, a setup used by local bookies to wash illicit cash. The men around him laughed, assuming a broke street kid was about to lose his lunch money. They had no idea they were watching a man who used to manipulate global markets before breakfast. Using his photographic memory of market algorithms, offshore trading patterns, and pending corporate mergers he had overseen just days prior, Ariyan began to trade. He turned $50 into 520 minutes. By leveraging high-risk penny stocks and riding a sudden crypto surge he knew was coming, 500 turned into 5,000. By nightfall, the terminal screen flashed a balance of $50,000. The room went dead silent. Victor, the heavy-set loan shark, stepped out of his office, staring at the screen in disbelief. Before Victor's thugs could move in to intimidate him, Ariyan stood up, tossed a stack of $100 bills onto the table, and paid off his entire debt to the kings in cash, leaving extra as a tip. He looked Victor dead in the eye with an authority that made the hardened criminal involuntarily step back. He told Victor that if he wanted to make real money, he would start taking orders from him. With $50,000 in hand, Ariyan began his transformation. He hired a disgraced, brilliant former Wall Street hacker living in Queens to scrub Ariyan's digital footprint and forge an airtight identity. Next, using a series of encrypted satellite codes only Xavier knew, he accessed a hidden, non-custodial Swiss vault account he had set up years ago as a contingency. $5 million was wired instantly into a newly established offshore hedge fund. Ariyan walked into a high-end tailor shop in Soho, shedding his dirty street clothes for a bespoke, charcoal, gray Italian suit. Standing before the full-length mirror, he adjusted his cuffs and buttoned his jacket, the exact signature movement of Xavier Rothchild. He stared at his reflection. The young face of Ariyan was no longer that of a victim. His eyes burned with the cold, calculating fire of a king returning to reclaim his throne. He looked out the window toward the glittering skyline of Manhattan across the river. Daniel had stolen his empire, but Ariyan was about to buy it back, piece by piece. Shadows of Fifth Avenue. The morning sun reflected off the sleek glass exterior of a penthouse condominium on Fifth Avenue. Below, the relentless rhythm of Manhattan traffic buzzed like a distant machine. Standing on the marble terrace, holding a porcelain cup of black coffee, Ariyan looked across the urban expanse toward Rothschild Tower. He was no longer the broke kid from the alleys of Brooklyn. To the world of elite finance, he was now Ariyan Shah, an enigmatic 22-year-old venture capitalist backed by a mysterious private equity fund out of Zurich. Inside Rothchild Global, chaos was brewing behind closed doors. Daniel had officially assumed the role of interim CEO, but his arrogant mismanagement was already creating fractures within the board of directors. Wall Street was skeptical. Stock prices were fluctuating wildly as rumors circulated that Daniel was preparing to liquidate key assets to clear massive corporate debts. Taking advantage of the turmoil, Ariyan instructed his hacker and financial team to act. Using dozens of shell corporations registered in Singapore and the Cayman Islands, he initiated an aggressive short squeeze on Rothchild Global's floating shares. While Daniel was distracted trying to calm nervous European investors, Ariyan quietly bought up every floating share hitting the open market. By Wednesday afternoon, the trade settled. Ariyan had acquired a 15% controlling stake in Rothchild Global, enough to legally demand a seat on the board and veto major structural decisions. In the executive suite of Rothschild Tower, Daniel slammed his fist onto his mahogany desk, staring at a red warning notification on his monitor. A mystery buyer had just established a massive position in his father's company overnight. Next to him, Eva stood with her arms crossed. Her eyes narrowed as she read the name on the filing: Shah Capital Management. Daniel demanded answers from his legal team, but nobody knew who Ariyan Shah was. He was a ghost with deep pockets and aggressive tactics. Realizing this unknown player posed a direct threat to his upcoming vote for permanent CEO status, Daniel instructed his secretary to extend an exclusive invitation to Shah Capital for the upcoming annual Rothschild Autumn Gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Sitting in his Fifth Avenue penthouse, Ariyan received the digital invitation on his encrypted phone. A cold, deliberate smile spread across his young face as he read Daniel's formal note requesting a private meeting during the event. Daniel was inviting a ghost into his house, completely unaware that the boy he planned to intimidate was the very man he had thrown off a balcony. Ariyan set his coffee cup down, picked up a sleek pen, and typed a one-word response accepting the invitation. The masquerade ball, the great hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art echoed with the swell of a live string orchestra. New York's absolute elite, politicians, hedge fund billionaires, and old money dynasties, mingled under chandeliers, clutching champagne flutes. At the center of it all stood Daniel Rothchild and Eva, acting as the hosts of the evening. Daniel radiated arrogance, basking in the greetings of power brokers who still believed he was the legitimate heir to the Rothschild fortune. Then, the heavy brass doors opened. The room didn't fall silent immediately, but a quiet ripple of curiosity spread through the crowd. Ariyan walked in, flanked by two formidable bodyguards in tailored suits. He wore a crisp, midnight blue tuxedo, his posture impeccably rigid, his demeanor overflowing with absolute control. Despite his youthful appearance, he carried an aura of immense power that commanded instant respect. Eva caught sight of him first. As her eyes locked onto Ariyan walking across the polished stone floor, her champagne glass trembled slightly in her hand. There was something unnervingly familiar about the way he moved. The steady, deliberate stride, the sharp tilt of his chin, the unyielding coldness in his eyes. It was a phantom grace she had only ever seen in one man, Xavier. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks and stepped forward, a practiced, patronizing smile plastered on his face as he approached the young investor. He extended his hand, offering a polite greeting to the elusive Mr. Shah, whose aggressive market moves had been keeping his legal team up at night. Ariyan looked down at Daniel's outstretched hand for a beat longer than was comfortable, before taking it in a firm, crushing grip. He leaned in slightly, his voice smooth as velvet, dripping with quiet malice. He quietly remarked that running a global empire required precision, not just ambition, and that managing a kingdom was entirely different from merely stealing one. Daniel's smile froze completely. Color drained from his face as a sudden, icy knot tied itself in his stomach. That exact phrase, managing a kingdom is different from stealing one, was a private lecture Xavier had given him 3 years ago in the boardrooms of Paris. No one else had been in that room. Before Daniel could regain his composure or demand an explanation, Ariyan turned toward the surrounding press corps and high society guests. Raising his glass slightly, his voice resonated clearly across the hall, announcing to the gathered investors and media that Shah Capital had officially acquired 15% of Rothchild Global. He declared that a special board meeting would be convened on Monday morning to address severe financial irregularities under current management. Flashing cameras illuminated the panic in Daniel's eyes and the growing horror on Eva's face. Ariyan took a slow sip of his drink, locked eyes with his brother through the flashing lights, and offered a cold, satisfied smirk. The ghost had entered the ballroom, and the nightmare was just beginning. The stage was set. The game was moving from the financial tickers to the high society ballrooms of Manhattan. Secrets in the vault, the aftermath of the masquerade ball sent shockwaves through Wall Street. Rothchild Global's stock plummeted as news of Shah Capital's hostile intervention swept financial networks. Inside his private estate, Daniel was unraveling. Paranoia consumed him. He launched a relentless, off-the-books investigation into Ariyan Shah, desperate to uncover how this 22-year-old outsider possessed intimate details of Xavier's personal philosophy. But Ariyan's forged background was an impenetrable fortress, backed by real Swiss capital and airtight shell structures. Meanwhile, Ariyan knew that corporate power alone wouldn't bring total victory. He needed leverage that went beyond stock percentages. He needed the truth. Under the cover of midnight, rain blanketed the city once again. Ariyan arrived at the rear entrance of Rothschild Tower. Using a cloned biometric keycard created by his hacker, and his own pristine memory of the building's classified layout, he bypassed 3 tiers of security sublevels. He descended into the deep basement of the skyscraper, standing before the high-security steel vault that held Xavier's private physical archives, a room Daniel didn't even know existed. Ariyan stepped up to the optical scanner. He placed his hand on the keypad, entering a 24-digit alphanumeric code that only Xavier Rothchild had ever generated. The heavy hydraulic bolts hissed, and the massive steel door swung open smoothly. Inside, beneath warm recessed lighting, sat rows of private ledgers, hard drives, and physical evidence files. Ariyan walked straight to a locked titanium briefcase hidden behind a false panel. Opening it with his personal combination, he pulled out a thick dossier marked with a crimson seal. As he flipped through the encrypted documents, the air left his lungs. Xavier's death hadn't been a simple, greedy land grab by a jealous stepbrother. Daniel was merely a puppet on a string. The plot had been engineered by the Raptors, a ruthless, shadowy syndicate operating deep within New York's criminal underworld, controlling human trafficking, illegal weapons trades, and political blackmail. Even more disturbing was the final document in the folder, a genealogy and offshore trust deed detailing Eva's true lineage. She was not an orphaned socialite, she was the daughter of Victor Vance, the elusive leader of the Raptors. Eva had been planted by Xavier's side years ago to monitor his movements and force a corporate takeover once Rothchild Global's liquidity reached its peak. Ariyan closed the dossier. His jaw set firm. The battle was no longer just a corporate chess match against his weak stepbrother. He was fighting the most dangerous syndicate in New York City. As he slipped the file into his coat and exited into the rain, slick alleyway, headlights suddenly flashed at the end of the block. A black SUV idled in the shadows. Its dark windows reflecting the neon light. The Raptors were already watching. The boardroom coupe sat Daniel flanked by his high-powered corporate warrior street, wrapping the top of Rothschild Tower in an eerie shroud. Inside the grand 17th floor boardroom, the exact floor where Xavier had been pushed to his death, the air was thick with tension. The entire board of directors sat around the polished mahogany table, murmuring nervously. At the head of the table sat Daniel, flanked by his high-powered corporate lawyers. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, but his posture remained defiantly aggressive. Daniel slammed his leather folder shut, calling the meeting to order. He immediately moved to pass a motion granting himself permanent CEO authority, claiming that external hostile forces were attempting to destabilize the legacy his late brother had built. Before the board could vote, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. Ariyan walked in slowly, accompanied by a team of forensic accountants and a cold-faced federal prosecutor. The board members fell silent, turning in their swivel chairs to stare at the young head of Shaw Capital. Daniel scoffed, telling Ariyan he had no right to interrupt a private executive vote. But Ariyan paid no attention to Daniel's outrage. He walked calmly to the head of the room, pulled a sleek metallic flash drive from his pocket, and plugged it directly into the central media console. Massive high-definition monitors surrounding the boardroom lit up instantly. Financial ledgers, offshore bank wire transfers, and encrypted communications flooded the screens. The evidence was damning and meticulous. It laid bare millions of dollars in systematic embezzlement, shell company kickbacks, and forged signatures orchestrated by Daniel over the past 6 months, specifically routing corporate funds into offshore accounts belonging to the Raptors syndicate. Panicked, Daniel shouted for security, but the guards at the door remained motionless, under explicit orders from the federal prosecutor standing quietly beside Ariyan. Ariyan leaned over the table, placing both hands flat on the polished wood, staring straight into Daniel's trembling eyes. In a calm, razor-sharp voice, Ariyan laid out the cold reality. Daniel wasn't a CEO. He was a liability facing decades in federal prison for fraud, treason and grand larceny. The room erupted into shouts, one by one. Terrified board members raised their hands to vote. The motion was unanimous. Daniel Rothchild was stripped of his executive power with immediate effect. Shaw Capital was granted temporary emergency management of Rothchild Global. As 2 federal agents stepped forward with handcuffs, the glass windows of the boardroom suddenly shattered in a violent shower of shards. Smoke grenades thundered through the broken frame. Chaos consumed the room as masked, heavily armed mercenaries rappelled down from a dark chopper, hovering outside the skyscraper. Amid the deafening smoke and gunfire, the mercenaries grabbed a terrified Daniel and dragged him out toward the balcony, pulling him into the waiting helicopter. As the smoke cleared, Ariyan stood unscathed amid the ruined boardroom, watching the unmarked helicopter vanish into the thick fog above New York. The corporate war was over, but the street war had just begun. Blood on Wall Street, the fog over Manhattan gave way to a relentless, cold rain as news of the boardroom raid flooded every global news network. Rothchild Tower was surrounded by federal agents, but Daniel was gone, spirited away into the underworld by Victor Vance's hitmen. The Raptors were no longer hiding behind shell companies and corporate proxies. With Daniel exposed and facing federal indictments, the syndicate mobilized its foot soldiers to burn down everything Xavier had left behind, starting with his resurrected self. That night, a convoy of blacked-out SUVs tore through the quiet streets of Soho. High-caliber gunfire shattered the front glass of Ariyan's private residence. Mortar-style explosives rocked the lobby as armed mercenaries swept through the building, clearing floors with lethal efficiency. They expected to find a young, helpless billionaire trapped inside a gold cage. Instead, they walked into a slaughterhouse of their own making. Ariyan hadn't spent his first weeks in Brooklyn just playing Wall Street algorithms. He knew how the street operated. Working alongside Victor's crew from Brooklyn and a team of rogue former special ops contractors, Ariyan turned the multi-level penthouse into a fatal funnel. He moved through the dark hallways like a shadow, using non-lethal tactical traps, suppressed firepower, and raw street hustle instincts to dismantle the hit squad piece by piece. When the smoke cleared, the penthouse was ruined, but Ariyan stood untouched, stepping over the disarmed mercenaries in the flickering emergency light. He pulled a burning flare from his tactical vest, tossed it onto the street below, and melted into the night before NYPD backup arrived. 2 hours later, Ariyan met quietly in an abandoned subway tunnel beneath Brooklyn with Eva. She sat shivering in the backseat of an unmarked sedan, her tailored dress stained with rain and dust, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She looked at Ariyan through the dim light of the tunnel, tears pooling in her eyes. For the first time, she broke her cold facade. She confessed that Victor Vance held her younger brother hostage in an underground facility at the Brooklyn docks, using him as collateral to force her compliance. She revealed that Daniel had lost his mind. He was hiding at the docks under heavy Raptor guard, desperate to transfer the last remaining $50 million of stolen Rothschild assets before fleeing the country on a cargo vessel. Eva handed Ariyan an encrypted drive containing the full schematic layout, guard rotations, and security codes for the dock warehouse. She looked up at Ariyan, her voice breaking as she admitted that she knew he wasn't just Ariyan Shah. She had felt Xavier's presence in him since the moment he walked into the Met Gala. Ariyan took the drive, his face an unreadable mask of ice. He didn't offer forgiveness, nor did he offer comfort. He simply told her to stay hidden, and let the dead finish what the living couldn't. Standing at the edge of the East River, looking across at the glowing skyline of Manhattan, Ariyan checked the chamber of his weapon. The boardrooms were silent. The stock market was closed. The final battle for New York would be settled in blood on the docks. The Heir returns. The waves of the East River crashed violently against the rusty metal pylons of Pier 42. Cold, misty rain blanketed the Brooklyn docks, where towering shipping containers cast long, jagged shadows across the asphalt. Inside a massive, poorly lit warehouse near the water's edge, armed mercenaries from the Raptor's syndicate stood guard, rifles raised, patrolling the perimeter. Deep inside the warehouse, amidst wooden crates and heavy machinery, Daniel sat at a makeshift desk, sweat glistening on his forehead. His fingers flew across a rugged laptop keyboard as he frantically attempted to execute a final, untraceable wire transfer of $50 million into an offshore Panamanian account. A cargo ship chugged in the harbor outside, its horn blaring, his ticket out of the country. Suddenly, the warehouse's central power grid cut out. The harsh halogen lights died, plunging the entire facility into pitch-black silence. Before the mercenaries could switch on their night vision gear, an explosion ripped through the rear loading doors. Shockwave grenades disoriented the guards, followed instantly by the crack of suppressed gunfire. Ariyan, backed by an elite tactical squad and his trusted allies from Brooklyn, moved through the darkness like a storm. He was no longer just the refined corporate titan Xavier, nor was he merely the street-hardened kid Ariyan. He was both, merged into a single, unstoppable force. Systematically, the Raptor guards fell. Gunfire echoed off the corrugated steel walls as Ariyan advanced through the crossfire, moving directly toward the central office bay. When the shooting finally ceased, a deafening quiet returned to the warehouse. Ariyan stepped through the heavy office doors, stepping calmly over the shattered glass. Daniel spun around, his hand shaking violently as he raised a black revolver, aiming it directly at Ariyan's chest. Daniel screaming, hysterical, "Stay back! Don't come any closer! Who are you? How do you know every code, every account, every move I make?" Ariyan stopped 5 feet away. He didn't flinch at the barrel of the gun pointing at his heart. Rain dripped from his dark coat onto the concrete floor. "Ariyan, you always were sloppy, Daniel. You thought money bought power, but you never understood the soul of this city." Ariyan reached up with his left hand, slowly unbuttoning the top button of his suit jacket, then adjusting his right cufflink with a slow, deliberate twist. The exact, unmistakable physical habit Xavier performed whenever he won a boardroom battle. Daniel's eyes widened in sheer, paralyzing horror. The color drained completely from his face. The gun in his hand began to tremble violently. Daniel's whispering, "No, no, it's impossible. You fell. I watched you die." Ariyan, voice low, cold as ice. You threw a man off a building, Daniel. But you forgot that New York belongs to those who survive its streets. Before Daniel could pull the trigger, sirens blared outside. Red and blue lights flashed through the high warehouse windows as dozens of federal tactical vehicles surrounded the pier. Police megaphones echoed across the harbor, demanding immediate surrender. Daniel looked at the flashing lights, then back at Ariyan's unyielding eyes. Overwhelmed by the realization that his empire was destroyed and his victim stood alive before him, Daniel's knees buckled. The revolver slipped from his numb fingers, clattering onto the cold floor. Federal agents swarmed the room, pinning Daniel to the ground and slapping heavy steel handcuffs on his wrists. As Daniel was dragged away into the storm, crying out in hysterical disbelief, Ariyan walked out of the warehouse into the crisp night air. Epilogue. A week later, the morning sun broke through the clouds, bathing Manhattan in brilliant golden light. On the 70th floor of Rothschild Tower, the shattered glass of the balcony had been replaced with crystal, clear panoramic panels. The executive boardroom was restored, its monitors displaying record, high stock confidence as Shaw Capital officially merged with Rothchild Global. Ariyan stood at the edge of the terrace, looking out over the sprawling, infinite horizon of New York City. The city below buzzed with life, unaware of the resurrection that had taken place in its shadows. He took a slow, deep breath, swirling a cup of hot coffee in his hand. He was young, invincible, and held the destiny of $100 billion empire in his hands. The lost heir had returned, not just to reclaim his throne, but to rule it better than before.